Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure and honor to welcome today Mr. Yofi Grant. I am Ishan D'Souza, a research fellow at the 16th Council, and today we are talking about our upcoming summit, the Global Strategy Nexus in Lagos. And as a precursor, we just wanted to sit down with you, Mr. Grant, and talk about some of the pressing challenges that Africa faces and how the private sector and business can effectively collaborate with governments and partner with them to solve some of these pressing challenges. May I request you to start with the introduction, please?
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Yofi Grant. I am a recent past CEO of the Ghana Investment Promotion Center, which is the government's IPA in Ghana. And I retired in December this year after 8 years as being the CEO. I was also on the board of the World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies for 3 terms of 2 years each. And I cut short my term on retirement. So I have a very regional view of where Africa should be and how Africa should conduct itself to maximize its opportunities.
And I don't think we could have anyone better to provide us certain insights on what are some of the key challenges that Africa faces. We talk about these big grand narratives of sustainable development, emerging technologies, and fostering growth. But I would like to get your view and opinion on some of the on-ground challenges that the individual people of Africa are facing, sometimes that are probably omitted in global policy discussions.
I know, a very interesting question and a very big question. Of course, I always believed that Africa had gone beyond its colonial past and was emerging into a new global power. But in the course of my work, I realized that it's not as simple as that, and that Africa had inherited certain systems that made us almost beholden to other parts of the global economy. But I think Africa's biggest stumbling block today is knowledge. Knowledge that I suspect that the fact that we have a low incidence of education, especially at the bottom end, makes it more difficult to be able to execute some of the intentions that we have. And I did say that we had inherited something from our colonial past, which made us susceptible to exploitation because we needed to grow very fast. And Africa being so rich in resources, mineral resources, without a doubt, Africa is home to almost 40% of the world's remaining resources. And some of them, the very mineral resources required for energy transition and for sustainability. And so you come to the continent, you find that it is very well endowed. Lithium, platinum, cobalt, coltan, chromium, zinc, copper, platinum, the gold, diamonds. And these are what the world requires to reset itself back to the pre-COVID growth period. And so the continent is extremely important. But the big, should I say, elephant in the room is the kind of contracts that we sign, the kind of understanding that we have, our politics, our policy implementation strategies, which for the longest time have not focused solely on internal, regeneration, but also considered the fact that we needed to grow very fast, so we're willing to sell our raw materials and minerals in the raw form and not focus on developing such that we can add value to those and perform at the higher ends of the value chain. And I think that Africa at this point is clearly in that space where there is a recognition, the clear recognition that, look, the only way we can grow our continent and create the continent we want is by adding value to our mineral resources. For example, think of batteries, all these batteries that are required, lithium batteries that are required for EV vehicles, etc. Almost 98% of the raw materials required are in Africa. And so why aren't we manufacturing these batteries? Even when you speak of hydrogen as a source of energy, you are likely to find major resources in Africa. You think of solar. Africa's solar radiation is compared to none. So we have all the energy required, potentially. If you look at our water bodies, there are a couple of rivers in Africa that can provide energy for the whole continent. But we have something else, which is even more important. We have the market. Today, Africa's population is well over a billion, about 1.4 billion people, of which 60% is under the age of 35. So you have a growing population, the youngest population in the world, very eager, very excited about their futures, who are truly an emerging consumer force globally. I'm not sure even China has that, nor India. And so that is very exciting for the continent, that if you are a global businessman and you're looking to do business, nobody will tell you if you blindfold yourself and you throw the dart, it will land on Africa. It has the resources, or the mineral resources, it has the potential energy sources, and it has the market. Now, the more important thing is that by the year 2050, this market would have grown significantly to about 2.6 billion people, which would be 1/4 of the world's population. At some point, India was there, at some point, China was there, and we saw how population size and market size really drove them to be global economies. And the same can happen to Africa. Now, you ask what some of the challenges are. One of the first ones that I think is a major hurdle for us is the multicultural environment. Africa has many countries that have very divergent cultures and very divergent speeches. On the African continent alone, you have French, English, Portuguese, and a couple of other languages. But if you look at the traditional cultures, hundreds and thousands of diverging cultures of different types. And when there's low education ratio, that makes it a problem. We need to, first of all, get to a certain minimum standard of education that is comprehensible by everybody or accessible to everybody. And then we can start understanding the visions that we craft. So that is one major hurdle that we face naturally. Education. We need to educate our people. The second one is what role Africa itself, and when I say Africa, I like to think cohesive together. What role has Africa itself identified for itself in the global economy? We do know, we've heard forever that there's a renaissance of Africa, Africa rising, and we keep rising and never getting to the minimum threshold that we ought to get to escalate beyond and fly. And why is that? And that is because perhaps the kind of engagement we've had over the past have not inured to Africa's growth positiveness and growth benefits. For example, today as we speak, the continent exports almost all its raw materials. And then it imports finished goods made out of those same raw materials. Now, that cannot be good for development because you're exporting at a certain price and you're importing back at multiples of that price. So you lose out on the value chain. Beyond that, because we are just exporting our raw materials and resources, including our food, we are not creating jobs fast enough. We need to create jobs for our young people, and I did say the majority of our population are young people. We need to find a strategic way of creating jobs for our young people, but just not jobs. Better paying jobs, highly sophisticated jobs in a world that has been driven by technology and driven by information dynamics and analytics and technology. When you look at this matrix of factors that we require, first we have the market, we have the raw materials, we have the potential energy sources, but we have the potential brain power. And Africa, indeed, can become a main source of new human capital to grow the world. Because he has the young people, and Africa is embracing technology, even AI, in a rate that is extremely fast and innovative. The continent has unique problems and requires unique solutions. And I believe that artificial intelligence and technology are going to bring those solutions. Now, one of the last ones that I also thought about is that we also need to improve our self-image. Now, because the continent has been exploited for so long, it leaves behind a certain image that, yeah, Africans, you can just go there and do whatever you want. No, you cannot. I think the new thinking on the new continent, a lot of the dynamic young brain power, the new leadership on the continent, is clearly focused to building our own by our own for our own, but also being a credible partner to the global economy. When you look at many parts of the world, many of the major economies are now inward looking. Started with America first. The UK cut out itself from Brexit. Many of the countries are looking, okay, post COVID, which really ravaged the world economy. How do we reset? And they started looking inwards. So you saw a decline in global FDI. You saw a decline in global aid. And we've seen what's happened recently in the United States of America. But it is very clear, and a lesson we should learn from the COVID pandemic, that you can't sit in one corner of the world and think you're immunized against other things happening on the other side of the world. It will catch up with you sooner or later, because what globalization did was to reconnect many other parts of the world. And we all reconnected. And as much as people believe there is a death of globalization, there is also a much more wider opening of the world to people. People are traveling, people are seeking education in other cultures, there's a lot of cultural mixes right now. And so the world has become much more sophisticated than it was maybe 100 years ago. And we are finding that people have 2-3 nationalities, carry 2-3 passports, and therefore are citizens of a number of countries. Now, that in itself is a major opportunity that we can leverage for global economic growth.
I agree. And you did mention the globalization of the economy in Africa's role in it, and oftentimes how it is associated with certain exploitative dynamics. And I just wanted to zoom in on that and talk about the resource extractive model that Africa is often part of in the global political economy. We see foreign countries coming to Africa and, as you said, extracting raw materials and doing solely that without establishing manufacturing in the continent or even refining facilities. As you said, the value add, therefore, is significantly declining. I wanted to ask you, how do you think the private sector can participate in this economic model? Because I'm a big proponent of endogenous driven growths, because that's the best way to reclaim economic sovereignty. What do you think the private sector in Africa can do to bolster the economic sovereignty of the continent?
I think that is a major question, without doubt. It's one that we cannot ask enough. Because when you look at governance on the continent, and I also go back, and when I started, I did say that one cannot just easily dismiss the ravages of colonialism in our past. Because what happened, the next few decades that happened when Africa went on its drive to be independent, was that there was a lot of central government push, because governments were those who then got the power and could change things. So for the longest time, the continent has not facilitated private sector capital growth or capital formation. So we've had weak private sectors. If you look at the whole continent, and if I remember right, correct me if I'm wrong, from the McKinsey study, there were probably kind of less than 400 billion billionaires on the continent. And sparsely, you find them located in isolated countries like South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya. The other countries were able to find billionaires. Whereas if you went to Europe, you find them diversified across the countries. And what has happened is that our own countries have not facilitated the growth of businesses, because most businesses, most of the environment has been controlled by central government. So there is this need for a rethinking of how that happened. Now, there have been significant efforts at that. Of course, without a doubt, the first one I would say is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, an area which creates the single largest free market in the world. That alone is a major motivation for Africa to industrialize and trade amongst itself, because that is the fastest way in which we can build wealth on the continent. Then, of course, there are many other private efforts like the Africa Prosperity Network, APN, which almost every year, at the beginning of the year, has this conference bringing government and private sector people together to see how a partnership can be forged, but not just a partnership, to see how we can eliminate the brick walls that are preventing us from moving up together. It's sometimes preposterous that you think that Africa has 50% of the world's gold deposits. Yet you labor to find indigenous African businesses that have built billions out of gold. They are isolated cases. But it should be there. And I always use my own country, Ghana, which is the leading gold producer on the continent. We can't find one indigenous billionaire out of the gold industry. We haven't even built one indigenous billionaire out of the cocoa industry, for which we are the second largest producer after Cote d'Ivoire. But you go to other countries who have never seen a cocoa tree and find billionaires out of cocoa. So obviously, we are missing something in the value chain. And we need to recollect, rethink, go back, recollect all these things and put them back together to our benefit. The young people in Africa, who form the majority of the population of the continent, are becoming more aggressive, more knowledgeable, have access to information, and so also in the same stream are becoming more nervous. Unless we create an environment which taps their potentials and puts it to great use for the benefit of the continent. I think that is key. Now, governments are there purely to create the ambient environment for businesses to thrive. Of course, we all would agree from the literature, and I used to be a major advocate of Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, which purported that modern governance be predicated on constitutional democracies, etc., liberal governments, etc., which has been challenged anyway, but I still believe in it. But I think that in itself sets the tone for the thinking that, yes, maybe governments really do what they ought to do. That's to create the opportunities for private sector people to benefit and grow and support private sectors. States need to give energy to their private sector players. I don't see the problem where a government picks winners in their economies and supports them. That's how you grow an economy. It's been adopted in almost every developed country. And so we ought to do the same. Africa just ought to do the same. And we have the potential to do that. We have the raw materials to do that. We have the markets to do that. What we don't have is something that we all need to put our fingers on. The will to do it, the political will to do it, the policy environment to do it, and then the drive. Energize and motivate our younger people to do it with educational knowledge. I think those are the things that we have, and that's how governments can partner with private sector people to grow their continent. Without a doubt, we would hesitate to say governments should partner with our private sector to enrich other areas in the world. We want our continent to be enriched. We need our people to get the jobs. We need to create an Africa where now, when we think of migration, people want to migrate to Africa because it presents the best of the world, not the other way around. We want an Africa where we are exporting much more than we are importing. And we are making good use of our raw materials to build the economy of the continent. And I think the AFCFTA creates a very good path for that to happen.
I agree. And going forward, I think what's going to be key in mitigating some of these vulnerabilities related to Africa's economic strategic autonomy is leveraging emerging technologies and sustainable growth. Because speaking from experience coming from India, we have benefited significantly from incorporating emerging technologies and providing public goods, especially welfare and public infrastructure in industries such as fintech. What advice would you give African governments and private sector entities to effectively integrate these technologies in governance mechanisms, and how can that be leveraged?
I think first and foremost is mindset. It's mindset that economies are about people. It's not just systems. And that people, of course, like you did say, India did a great job in making sure the social amenities were available and the ambient environment was available with technology, and creating a regulatory framework which enabled people to grow in the IT space. Africa has its own opportunities. Africa should not be India, nor Africa be China. Africa should be better than India and China because we have examples to lean on. And so even as we invite partners onto the continent, we should know that we have the upper hand. We have the market, we have the raw materials, and we just need the brain power to convert those into viable economies. And so I think our leaders ought to be bolder, ought to be more aggressive, empowering the private sector. And not sometimes make it seem like the private sector is contrary to government or growth of economies or a country's economy. The private sector, the main motivation of the private sector is growth and profitability that will facilitate growth. It's not a bad thing because it creates more opportunity for others. The more investment we have in a country, the more businesses we create. The more businesses we create, the more jobs we create. The more jobs we create, the more we take people off the street, empower them to be growing their economies, and the more the governments can earn the taxes they deserve. That's one. Secondly, our institutions should not be seen to be hampering private sector growth. They should be seen to be working significantly for our private sector. We know the world has become much more complicated. Technology has taken the center stage. But we have young people who are embracing this much more like they're embracing oxygen in their breath. They understand it. People under trees, etc., are putting together code to bring unique solutions. So it's not even necessarily in the classroom anymore. And we should facilitate and support and motivate that. We should empower our own people. We can empower foreigners. We should empower our own. But having said that, doesn't mean that therefore we should shut the door for partnerships. The global economy creates ample opportunity for growth of sectors. Today, post-COVID and post the conflicts that we are seeing globally, it's brought about a new thinking, where now many economies are reshoring, onshoring, friendshoring, and looking for new opportunities. They are looking for smarter ways of creating products. I don't think Africa can be left out of that. Indeed, for me, Africa is the continent that will take the world back to pre-COVID growth rates. Africa, the world will rely more on Africa than Africa will rely on the world if Africa gets its act together. Because we have the population, we have the raw materials, we have the energy, and we have the hunger to drive us to do things. I think we do have the hunger to drive us to do things. So once governments come in, it's their core mandate and their responsibility to think in that line. It's not just about being in power for 40 years, 30 years that makes things work. It's about what you deliver to your people to grow. We should add even new dynamics to finding the success of a leader. If you're a leader of a country and in your tenure, you can't grow 10 billionaires, then obviously you haven't done your work in full, considering the raw materials and resources we have. Every leader should make it his business. That let's grow, let's create wealth on the continent. Let's facilitate wealth creation and empower people.
Absolutely. And I think this is a fantastic trailer to what's to come in the Lagos Summit and meeting you and, of course, people like you. So if you could give us one line about what are the potential outcomes that excite you the most from the upcoming summit that the audience should know about.
I think for me, the most exciting thing is the possibility of partnerships and listening to each other and creating an environment that we can all exploit to create wealth creation, contrary to what was believed in the past. It's a great thing. It's a good thing. The more wealth we create in our countries, the more we solve the problems of our people. And it's very important that we do that. We need to create wealth. We need to facilitate wealth creation. And we need to create environment partnerships. Partnerships are good things. And I think for Africa, the two most compelling reasons why this conference should take place is SDG 1 and SDG 17. SDG 1 is poverty elimination. SDG 17 is partnerships for trade and growth. I think those are the key things that we should have at the top of our heads.
Indeed. And I think this event promises to be a gold mine for networking, for partnership creation, and all of these amazing things. It's going to be great for Africa. It's going to be great for all of us, and it's going to be great for everyone. I'm personally very excited to be there to meet you and other pioneers like you in the public policy and business space. We just hope that we can welcome as many of our viewers there. And
very much. We look forward to it.
And thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. Thank you for taking the time to attend the summit, and we look forward to seeing you there, sir.
Thank you very much.